long before the rise of Alexander the Great, before Rome became an empire, and before the idea of Europe even existed. The ancient world witnessed a clash that would define the future of Western civilization, a struggle between absolute imperial power and fiercely independent city-states. This was not merely a war of armies, but a war of systems, values, and identities. On one side stood the vast Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known. On the other stood a collection of Greek city-states, divided, argumentative, and vastly outnumbered. Against all odds, their conflict would shape history forever. This was the Greco-Persian Wars. In the early 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the borders of Egypt and Thrace in the west. Founded by Cyrus the Great and expanded by his successors, Persia was a sophisticated imperial machine. It ruled over dozens of cultures, languages, and religions. Persian kings did not seek to destroy local traditions. Instead, they ruled through tolerance, bureaucracy, and overwhelming military force. Satraps governed provinces, taxes flowed steadily, and the royal road connected the empire like arteries of power. To the Persians, order was sacred. Rebellion was chaos, and chaos had to be crushed. Across the Aegean Sea lay a very different world. Greece was not a single nation. It was a fractured landscape of independent city-states, each jealous of its autonomy. Athens experimented with democracy. Sparta perfected militarism. Corinth thrived on trade. The Greeks shared language, religion, and cultural traditions. But politically, they were deeply divided. They argued constantly, fought each other regularly, and rarely agreed on anything. Yet what united them was something Persia could never fully understand: an intense devotion to freedom and self-rule. The conflict between Persia and Greece did not begin with grand invasions or famous battles. It began quietly, in the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Along the western coast of modern-day Turkey were prosperous Greek settlements known as Ionia. These cities had once been independent, but by the late 6th century BCE, they had fallen under Persian control. While Persian rule was relatively tolerant, it replaced local self-government with Persian-backed tyrants. For the Greeks of Ionia, this loss of political freedom was unbearable. In 499 BCE, the Ionian cities revolted. The Ionian Revolt was the spark that ignited decades of war. Led by the city of Miletus, the rebels sought help from mainland Greece. Most city-states refused, unwilling to provoke Persia. Only Athens and Eritrea sent support, a small fleet that would have enormous consequences. Together, the rebels managed to burn Sardis, the Persian regional capital. For the Persian king Darius I, this was more than rebellion. It was an insult. The revolt was eventually crushed. Miletus was destroyed. Its population was enslaved or deported. Persian authority was restored with brutal efficiency. But Darius did not forget who had helped the rebels. According to ancient sources, he ordered a servant to remind him every day, "Master, remember the Athenians." From that moment on, war was inevitable. Darius did not see Greece as a formidable enemy. To him, the Greek city-states were disorganized, quarrelsome, and weak. He intended to punish Athens and Eritrea, secure the Aegean, and extend Persian dominance into Europe. What he underestimated was Greek resolve and the strategic genius that would emerge under pressure. Persia's first major move came in 492 BCE, when a massive expedition led by Mardonius crossed into Thrace. The campaign was partially successful, but disaster struck when storms destroyed much of the Persian fleet. The invasion was postponed, but not abandoned. 2 years later, Persia returned with force. In 490 BCE, a Persian army landed at Marathon, a plain just north of Athens. The objective was clear: defeat Athens, restore a friendly government, and demonstrate Persian supremacy. The Persian army was professional, experienced, and numerically superior. Facing them were Athenian citizen soldiers and a small force from Plataea. Against all logic, the Greeks chose to attack. The Battle of Marathon would become legendary. The heavily armored Greek hoplites charged the Persian lines, using discipline and cohesion to break the enemy formation. The Persians, unprepared for such aggression, collapsed. It was a stunning victory. Marathon proved something revolutionary. The Persian army could be beaten. But victory came at a cost. The Greeks now understood the magnitude of the threat they faced. Persia would return. And next time, it would come with overwhelming force. After Marathon, Darius began preparations for a far greater invasion. But before he could act, he died. The task fell to his son, Xerxes I. Xerxes inherited not only an empire, but a mission. He spent years preparing for the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. Bridges were built across the Hellespont. Canals were dug through mountains. Supplies were stockpiled from Egypt to Anatolia. Soldiers were drawn from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Babylonians, and more. Herodotus, the ancient historian, claimed Xerxes' army numbered in the millions. Modern historians consider this exaggerated, but there is no doubt the force was enormous. In Greece, fear spread rapidly. Most Greek city-states knew they could not face Persia alone. Slowly, reluctantly, a defensive alliance formed. Athens and Sparta, traditional rivals, agreed to cooperate. It was an uneasy partnership, but survival demanded unity. Themistocles, an Athenian statesman and strategist, understood that Persia's true strength lay in its navy. He convinced Athens to build a massive fleet of triremes. This decision would prove decisive. As Xerxes marched westward, the Greeks debated where to make their stand. Eventually, they chose a narrow mountain pass in northern Greece, where Persia's numbers would be less effective. That place was Thermopylae. In 480 BCE, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta confronted Xerxes' army at the pass. The Greeks held the narrow ground, repelling Persian attacks day after day. Spartan discipline and hoplite tactics proved devastating. But the stand at Thermopylae was doomed. A local Greek betrayed the position, revealing a mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank the defenders. Leonidas dismissed most of the army and stayed behind with a small force, including his 300 Spartans. They fought to the death. Thermopylae was a Persian victory, but it became a Greek legend. It symbolized sacrifice, resistance, and defiance against impossible odds. As Xerxes advanced, Athens was evacuated. The city was captured and burned. Temples were destroyed. To many Greeks, it seemed the end had come. But the war was far from over. The Persian Empire did not respond to Greek defiance with haste, but with calculation. Darius understood that brute force alone would not be enough to dominate the fiercely independent Greek world. Greece was not a single nation. It was a fragmented landscape of rival city-states, each jealous of its autonomy, each suspicious of the others. Persia's strategy was simple and ancient: divide, isolate, and crush. The first phase of Persian retaliation came not with fire and blood, but with messengers. Persian envoys traveled across Greece demanding the traditional symbols of submission: earth and water. Many city-states complied, some out of fear, others out of pragmatism. Persia, after all, was the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Resistance seemed futile. But two cities refused: Athens and Sparta. In Athens, the envoys were thrown into a pit. In Sparta, they were cast down a well and told to fetch their own earth and water. These acts were not merely insults. They were declarations of war. Darius now had his justification. In 492 BCE, Persian forces under General Mardonius advanced into Thrace and Macedonia, restoring Persian authority in the region. But nature intervened where men could not. A violent storm wrecked much of the Persian fleet off the coast of Mount Athos, killing thousands. The invasion was halted. Persia learned from failure. The next invasion would be better planned, better supplied, and more decisive. In 490 BCE, a new Persian expedition set sail across the Aegean. This time, the objective was clear: punish Athens and Eritrea, and demonstrate Persian supremacy once and for all. The Persians captured Eritrea after a brief siege. The city was burned. Its population deported deep into the empire. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate of defiance. Athens now stood alone. When Persian forces landed at Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens, panic spread through the city. The Persian army was larger, better equipped, and supported by cavalry. Conventional wisdom suggested Athens should retreat behind its walls and wait. But Athens did not wait. Instead, a small force of around 10,000 Athenian hoplites marched out to meet the Persians in open battle. They were joined by 1,000 soldiers from Plataea, a loyal ally. Against all expectations, the Greeks attacked. The Battle of Marathon was not just a clash of armies. It was a clash of military systems. Persian troops relied on mobility, archers, and lightly armored infantry. Greek hoplites fought in dense formations, protected by heavy shields and bronze armor, armed with long spears designed for close combat. When the Greeks charged, they closed the distance quickly, neutralizing Persian archers. The hoplite phalanx crushed the Persian center while deliberately allowing the wings to bend, then encircled the enemy. The result was catastrophic for Persia. Thousands of Persian soldiers were killed. The survivors fled to their ships. Athens had achieved the unthinkable. They had defeated the Persian Empire in open battle. Marathon became legend almost instantly. It proved that Persia was not invincible. More importantly, it transformed Athens' sense of identity. They were no longer just a city-state. They were defenders of freedom. But Persia did not forget. Darius began planning a far greater invasion, one designed not merely to punish, but to conquer all of Greece. Before he could act, he died, leaving the task to his son, Xerxes. Xerxes inherited the largest empire on earth and an unfinished war. Unlike his father, Xerxes prepared on a scale that stunned the ancient world. For years, resources were gathered from across the empire. Engineers built bridges across the Hellespont. Supply depots were established along the invasion route. The Persian army was not merely large. It was multinational, drawn from dozens of subject peoples. Herodotus would later exaggerate Persian numbers into the millions. But even conservative estimates suggest an army of hundreds of thousands, supported by a massive fleet. This was not a raid. It was an extinction-level invasion. As Persia prepared, Greece argued. Old rivalries resurfaced. Some city-states favored submission. Others called for resistance. Sparta hesitated, constrained by religious festivals and internal politics. Athens feared being sacrificed for the greater good. Yet slowly, a fragile alliance emerged. Athens committed its fleet. Sparta agreed to lead the land forces. Smaller city-states pledged troops and ships. It was not unity born of trust, but of desperation. The Greeks understood that Persia's advantage lay in numbers and mobility. Their only hope was to fight on terrain that neutralized those advantages. The first stand would be at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a narrow coastal pass where mountains met the sea. There, a massive Persian army could be forced into a confined space, unable to deploy its full strength. In 480 BCE, a small Greek force led by King Leonidas of Sparta took position at the pass. Among them were the famous 300 Spartan warriors, supported by several thousand allies. 4 days, the Greeks held. Persian infantry attacked again and again, but the hoplite formation proved impenetrable. Even the elite immortals, Persia's finest troops, failed to break through. But no defense is perfect. A local Greek named Ephialtes betrayed the defenders, revealing a mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the pass. Leonidas understood what this meant. Escape was possible, but retreat would expose the rest of Greece. He chose sacrifice. Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek army and remained behind, with his Spartans and a small contingent of allies. They fought to the death. Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The road to central Greece lay open. But strategically, Thermopylae was a Greek triumph. The myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered again. Greece had proven that courage, discipline, and terrain could challenge overwhelming power. As Xerxes advanced south, Athens faced an impossible decision. The city could not be defended. The Athenians evacuated, placing their fate in their fleet. Athens was abandoned. When Persian forces arrived, they found an empty city. They burned it to the ground. Temples were destroyed. Statues were shattered. The Acropolis was desecrated. To Xerxes, this was vengeance. To the Greeks, it was proof that the war was now existential. The decisive confrontation would not be on land, but at sea. The Greek fleet gathered in the narrow straits of Salamis. Themistocles, the Athenian strategist, understood naval warfare better than any man alive. He knew the Persian fleet was larger, but also less coordinated. By luring the Persian navy into the confined waters of the strait, Themistocles forced them into chaos. At Salamis, size became a liability. Persian ships collided with one another. Greek triremes rammed and boarded with deadly efficiency. The battle turned into a massacre. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as his fleet was destroyed. Salamis changed everything. Persia still possessed enormous land forces, but without naval dominance. Supply lines were threatened. Control of the Aegean slipped from Persian hands. The following year, the Greeks delivered the final blow. At Plataea, a combined Greek army met the Persian land forces. The battle was brutal and chaotic, but ultimately decisive. Persian forces were annihilated. On the same day, Greek ships destroyed the remaining Persian fleet at Mycale. The invasion was over. Persia would never again attempt to conquer mainland Greece. The Greco-Persian Wars reshaped history. Athens emerged as a naval superpower. Sparta's reputation as a land force was cemented. Greek confidence soared. Out of the ruins of war emerged art, philosophy, democracy, and science that would define Western civilization. For Persia, defeat did not mean collapse. The empire endured for another century and a half, but its expansion westward had been permanently halted. This was not merely a war between states. It was a struggle between systems. Imperial rule versus civic freedom. Centralized authority versus local autonomy. Absolute power versus collective identity. The echoes of this conflict would resonate for generations, inspiring future wars, future heroes, and future myths. And yet, the war was far from finished. Its consequences were only beginning. The Persian response to the Greek advance was not immediate collapse, but strategic adaptation. Darius III understood that he could not always confront the Greeks directly on terrain, favorable to hoplite formations. Instead, Persian commanders increasingly relied on scorched earth tactics, cavalry harassment, and political manipulation. Satraps were instructed to deny supplies to Greek forces, burn crops, and retreat rather than offer pitched battle. This strategy slowed Greek momentum and forced them into longer, riskier campaigns. At the same time, Persia attempted to fracture Greek unity. Envoys were sent to city-states with gold and promises of autonomy, encouraging rebellion against the anti-Persian alliance. In several regions, this tactic worked. Internal divisions resurfaced, reminding the Greeks that their unity was fragile and conditional. Despite these efforts, Persian authority in the Aegean and Western Anatolia continued to erode. Greek naval power, combined with local revolts, gradually dismantled Persian control along the coast. Ionian cities that had once been brutally suppressed now regained autonomy, at least temporarily, under Greek protection. This shift had long-term consequences. For the first time, the Persian Empire faced not just a foreign invasion, but a sustained ideological challenge. The Greeks framed their struggle as one between freedom and tyranny, casting Persia as an autocratic force opposed to civic autonomy. While this portrayal oversimplified Persian governance, it proved highly effective as propaganda. The Persian court, meanwhile, struggled with internal instability. Darius III inherited an empire weakened by palace coups, assassinations, and distrust among elites. Satraps often acted independently, prioritizing personal survival over imperial cohesion. Loyalty to the great king was no longer guaranteed. As Greek forces advanced deeper into Persian-controlled territories, they encountered a vast, diverse empire unlike anything they had known. From fertile river valleys to arid plateaus, from ancient cities to nomadic frontiers, Persia was not a monolith but a complex network of peoples, cultures, and administrative systems. This diversity had once been Persia's greatest strength. Now, it became a vulnerability. Persian logistics were strained by the need to coordinate across immense distances. Communication delays, rivalries between commanders, and cultural misunderstandings weakened responses to fast-moving Greek armies. In contrast, Greek forces operated with greater flexibility, adapting tactics to local conditions and exploiting Persian hesitation. The psychological impact of repeated Persian setbacks cannot be overstated. Each lost city, each failed defense, chipped away at the image of Persian invincibility. Subject peoples began to question whether the empire could still protect them. Some cooperated with the Greeks. Others prepared for the possibility of a post-Persian future. Yet the Persian Empire did not collapse overnight. It resisted fiercely, learning from defeat and reorganizing its forces. Cavalry units were retrained, command structures adjusted, and battlefield coordination improved. Persian generals studied Greek tactics, seeking ways to counter the phalanx and exploit its weaknesses. These adaptations set the stage for even greater confrontations. Ahead, battles that would decide not only territorial control, but the fate of empires. What was unfolding was no longer merely a defensive war for Persia or a retaliatory campaign for Greece. It had become a struggle over who would define the political and cultural order of the known world. The conflict reshaped identities on both sides. Greeks, once divided by constant rivalry, began to see themselves as participants in a shared historical mission. Persians, facing an unprecedented external threat, were forced to confront the limits of imperial power and the dangers of internal fragmentation. History rarely turns on a single battle or moment. It shifts through accumulation, through decisions made under pressure, through alliances formed and broken, through victories that inspire and defeats that humiliate. By this stage of the war, the balance had not yet fully tipped, but the direction of change was becoming unmistakable. The Persian Empire still stood vast and formidable, but its foundations were no longer unshaken, and the forces challenging it were no longer merely resisting domination. They were preparing to replace it. As the war dragged on, the world around the conflict began to change. Kingdoms that once stood firm started to weaken. Alliances fractured. Trade routes were disrupted. Entire regions were emptied of men who had marched to war and never returned. What began as a clash between powers slowly became a transformation of civilization itself. The battlefield was no longer just a place of combat. It became a testing ground for new strategies, new weapons, and new ways of thinking. Generals learned that brute force alone could not guarantee victory. Intelligence, deception, timing, and logistics became just as important as courage and numbers. Supply lines determined whether armies survived, whether shaped outcomes more than ambition ever could. The soldiers themselves paid the highest price. Ancient warfare offered no mercy. Wounds were often fatal not because of the injury, but because of infection. Armor protected the body but exhausted the wearer. Hunger and disease killed more men than enemy blades. For most soldiers, glory was a lie told by those who never fought. Civilians suffered silently. Cities were looted, fields burned, families displaced. Women and children became victims of decisions made by kings and commanders, far removed from the suffering. On the ground, entire generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. As years passed, the war began to consume the very systems that supported it. Economies collapsed under the weight of constant mobilization. Coins lost value. Farmers abandoned their land. Craftsmen were drafted into armies. What had once been prosperous societies slowly eroded from within. Leaders who had once been celebrated began to face opposition. Victories no longer inspired hope, only exhaustion. Rebellions emerged not because enemies were strong, but because people were tired. Loyalty faded. Trust disappeared. Eventually, the conflict reached a breaking point. The decisive moments did not always arrive with grand battles. Sometimes they came quietly. A treaty signed in secret. A betrayal by a trusted ally. The death of a leader whose authority held everything together. When that figure was gone, the structure collapsed. The end of the war did not bring peace as many had imagined. Instead, it left behind a fractured world. Borders were redrawn, but resentment remained. Survivors carried trauma that words could not describe. Victory tasted hollow when measured against the cost. Historians would later argue about who truly won. Some would point to territory gained, others to enemies defeated. But those who lived through it knew the truth. No one truly wins a war of such scale. In the decades that followed, the consequences became clearer. New powers rose from the ruins of the old. Ideas born from the conflict reshaped governance, military doctrine, and diplomacy. Future empires studied the war carefully, learning both what to imitate and what to avoid. Writers, poets, and chroniclers preserved the memory of the conflict. Over time, Facts blended with interpretation. Heroes were exaggerated. Failures softened. The war became a story, then a legend, then a lesson. Archaeologists would one day uncover weapons rusted into the soil, walls shattered by siege, and graves filled with nameless soldiers. Each discovery served as a reminder that behind every historical narrative lies human suffering. Modern historians now view this war not as an isolated event, but as a turning point. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It showed the limits of power. It exposed the fragility of even the strongest systems. The conflict teaches a timeless lesson. Ambition without restraint leads to destruction. Power without responsibility invites collapse. And history, no matter how distant, is never truly silent. The echoes of this war still shape the world today. Political borders, cultural identities, and military strategies all carry traces of decisions made centuries ago. Even now, leaders study its mistakes and victories, hoping to avoid repeating them. But history shows us something uncomfortable. Humanity rarely learns quickly. The same patterns repeat. Pride rises. Fear spreads. Violence follows. That is why this story matters. Not because of the battles or the leaders, but because it reveals who we are when tested by power, fear, and ambition. It reminds us that behind every empire, every war, and every victory, there are lives forever changed. And when the dust finally settles, history does not remember the noise of the battlefield. It remembers the consequences.